America's second largest export in the 1880s wasn't steel or wheat or manufactured goods. It was frozen water cut from New England ponds and shipped to India. By 1900, the ice harvesting industry was the ninth largest in the United States by financial value, employing 90,000 people and 25,000 horses to cut, transport, and store 25 million tons of ice annually. Then within 50 years, the entire operation vanished so completely that most Americans today have no idea it ever existed. I found this while researching early American logistics networks, trying to understand how cities functioned before modern infrastructure. The numbers made no sense at first. How do you employ nearly 100,000 people to harvest a product that melts? How do you ship ice 12,500 kilometers to Calcutta and arrive with anything left to sell? The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just an industry. It was an empire built on frozen lakes, and it changed everything about how Americans lived, ate, and built cities. The story begins with a 23-year-old from Boston who had an idea everyone told him was insane. Frederic Tudor was the third son of a wealthy lawyer, which in early 1800s, Boston meant he had money, but no clear path to making more of it. His older brother became a literary figure. Frederick refused Harvard and spent his teenage years obsessing over business instead. In 1806, he bought a ship called the Favorite, loaded it with ice cut from his father's farm in Saugus, and sailed 1,500 miles south to Martinique. The voyage took 3 weeks. Most of the ice melted. Tudor sold what remained at a $4,500 loss. He went back and tried again and again. Creditors chased him. He landed in debtor's prison twice. But Tudor understood something no one else did yet. Once people tasted cold drinks in a tropical climate, they would never go back to warm ones willingly. So he gave ice away for free to bars and cafes across the Caribbean, creating demand before trying to profit from supply. It's the same strategy tech startups use today. Hook the customer first, monetize later. By the time Tudor died in 1864, he was worth $200 million in today's currency. They called him the Ice King, and his wealth came from teaching the world to crave something they'd never known they needed. But Tudor's success depended entirely on someone else's invention, a man whose name appears in almost none of the histories. Nathaniel Wyeth grew up on the shores of Fresh Pond in Massachusetts. Tudor hired him in the 1820s when the business was still struggling, still relying on workers with pickaxes and chisels, hacking away at frozen lakes one block at a time. Wyeth looked at the problem differently. He designed a horse-drawn plow with parallel blades that could score a grid pattern across the ice surface, marking out uniform blocks before anyone started cutting. Then he developed a toothed plow that could cut through the ice itself, eliminating the handsaws that had slowed everything down. The result was industrial-scale harvesting. A crew that might have cut 50 blocks in a day could now cut 500. And because the blocks were uniform, they stacked efficiently, shipped efficiently, and melted slower because there were fewer gaps between them. It was only after Wyeth's innovations that Tudor's business became genuinely profitable. Here's what the process looked like by mid-century. Workers would wait until ice reached 16 to 18 inches thick, usually by mid-January. The horse-drawn plows would score the lake surface in a grid, each square approximately 22 inches. Men with breaker bars and saws would separate the blocks, each one weighing 250 to 300 pounds. The blocks were floated to shore using the lake's own water as a transport system, then hauled up ramps into massive wooden ice houses. These weren't small sheds. The ice houses built along the Hudson River and Kennebec River in Maine could hold anywhere from 5,000 to 80,000 tons. Some reached capacities of 200,000 to 300,000 tons in major cities. The Hudson River alone had 135 major warehouses employing 20,000 workers. The insulation technology was as important as the cutting technology. Sawdust proved to be one of the most effective insulators available, and conveniently, New England's lumber industry produced it as waste. Workers would pack sawdust between the ice blocks and the wooden walls, sometimes 3 feet thick. The air trapped between sawdust particles created a barrier that could keep ice frozen through summer heat. A well-built ice house could preserve its contents for an entire year until the next harvest. 1 acre of ice at 12 inches thick yielded about 1,000 tons. Do the math on 25 million tons annually and you start to understand the scale. Entire lakes were being sectioned, cut, and shipped. And shipped is the part that sounds impossible until you see the records. In 1833, Tudor sent ice to Calcutta, India, 12,500 kilometers from Boston. The voyage took months. It worked. He expanded to Bombay and Madras. By 1847, 353 ships left Boston Harbor carrying ice to the American South, to Rio de Janeiro, to Hong Kong. Boston exported 75,000 tons that year and used another 27,000 locally. The first ice cream ever eaten in India was made with Massachusetts ice. Boston salmon and lobster arrived in Calcutta packed in the same shipments. Tudor wasn't just selling ice. He was exporting an entire cold supply chain that made other industries possible. But something shifted in the decades that followed. The international trade that had made Tudor famous began losing importance compared to domestic demand. And the reason was simple. American cities were exploding in size, and they were all getting very, very hungry. New York City and Philadelphia became the largest consumers of ice in the world during their brutal summers. The focus of the ice trade turned inward, supplying eastern cities first, then pushing west as the country expanded. By the 1880s, New York City alone had over 1,500 ice delivery wagons. Americans were consuming 5 million tons annually just for domestic use. The infrastructure required to support this is where the story gets strange, because what we're really talking about is an entirely different version of how cities operated, one that required a product harvested once a year in winter to flow continuously through every month that followed, which means the ice houses weren't just storage. They were the supply chain itself, massive reserves positioned throughout the country to keep the system alive. And then there's the workforce, 90,000 people, 25,000 horses, an industry capitalized at $28 million at its peak, the 9th largest industry in America by financial measure in 1900. All of it dependent on frozen lakes and the men who knew how to cut them into cubes. The Iceman became one of the most recognizable figures in American urban life. Every morning, the sound of iron-shod hooves on cobblestone announced his arrival. Housewives would place cards in their windows, 25, 50, or 100 pounds displayed in bold numbers. The Iceman, armed with metal tongs and leather gloves thick enough to grip frozen blocks, would haul the delivery up tenement stairs, through kitchen doors, and slide it into the household icebox. This happened daily, sometimes twice daily in summer. In the 1880s, New York City alone had 1,500 ice wagons making these rounds. The system worked because it had to. Without ice, meat spoiled in hours. Milk turned, produce wilted. Ice didn't just preserve food. It made modern urban life possible. You couldn't pack millions of people into cities without a way to keep food safe between the farm and the table. The icebox in every kitchen wasn't luxury. It was infrastructure. But here's what strikes me most about this entire operation. It depended entirely on winter. One season, one harvest. Everything cut between December and February had to last 12 months. If the winter was warm, if the ice didn't freeze thick enough, the entire system faced collapse. There was no backup, no alternative supply. The country ran on frozen water and hope, which makes what happened next feel inevitable. By the 1850s, inventors in Australia and India were experimenting with artificial ice production, mechanical refrigeration, powered by steam engines and chemical processes. The technology was expensive and unreliable at first. Natural ice remained cheaper and more dependable. But slowly, plant ice, as it was called, began competing. By 1914, the United States was producing 24 million tons of manufactured ice and 26 million tons of natural ice annually. For the first time, artificial production nearly matched natural harvest. The balance had shifted. Then came electricity. In the 1930s, electric refrigerators dropped in price dramatically. New Deal loans encouraged Americans to replace their ice boxes with machines that didn't require daily deliveries or melting blocks flooding kitchen floors. During the Great Depression, throwing away food became unthinkable, and refrigerators offered more space, more control, longer preservation. Sales surged after 1935. Rural electrification arrived in the late 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt's Rural Electrification Administration, bringing power lines to farms and small towns that had never had access before. By 1950, 90% of American city homes had mechanical refrigerators. 80% of rural households had them too. The ice wagons stopped running. The industry that had employed 90,000 people, that had built empires and supplied continents, that had turned frozen lakes into global commodities, simply ended. By the mid-1950s, the ice business was almost completely gone. Over 100 years of infrastructure, innovation, and investment couldn't compete with a machine you plugged into the wall. But the strangest part isn't that it ended. The strangest part is how completely it's been forgotten. Most people today have no idea this industry ever existed at this scale. We know about railroads, steel mills, oil fields. We don't know about ice. 25 million tons harvested annually at the peak. Ships crossing oceans carrying frozen cargo. An entire supply chain built around a product that melts. It sounds impossible until you see the photographs. Men standing on frozen rivers next to stacks of ice blocks 10 feet high. Horses pulling plows across lakes, cutting grids into the surface. Warehouses the size of aircraft hangars packed floor to ceiling with ice insulated by sawdust. The infrastructure was real. The scale was massive. And then it vanished, not gradually, but within a single generation. By 1960, children growing up had no memory of icemen or ice wagons or the cards in windows. Their grandparents remembered, but the world had moved on. Which brings me back to the question I started with. How does an industry this large disappear so completely from collective memory? Part of it is technological replacement. When something better arrives, we stop thinking about what came before. Nobody romanticizes the ice box when they have a refrigerator. But there's something else happening here. The ice trade required an understanding of seasonal cycles, of planning 12 months ahead, of building reserve capacity that could survive an entire year. It required physical infrastructure at a scale we associate with permanent industry, but it was based on something temporary. Frozen water. The whole system existed in a state of controlled melting. Everything was always running out. The refrigerator didn't just replace ice, it replaced an entire way of thinking about preservation and supply. It made the problem continuous instead of seasonal. You didn't harvest cold once a year anymore. You manufactured it on demand. That shift in thinking erased the context that made ice harvesting comprehensible. We can't imagine depending on winter because we don't have to anymore. So we forget that an entire civilization once did. The last ice harvest on the Hudson River happened sometime in the early 1950s. No ceremony marked it. No announcement declared the end. The workers simply didn't return the following winter. The warehouses stood empty for a while, then were torn down or repurposed. The tools were sold as scrap, the horses were retired, and the knowledge of how to read ice thickness, how to cut it efficiently, how to store it for months without loss, that knowledge died with the men who held it. Now we have freezers. We have climate-controlled supply chains. We have refrigerated trucks crossing continents, and none of it requires winter. That's progress. But I think about those men on the frozen lakes, cutting blocks that would travel halfway around the world, preserved by nothing but sawdust and wood. They built something that seemed permanent. It lasted 150 years. Then it ended so completely that most people don't know it ever existed. I keep coming back to a single image, an old photograph from 1920, workers standing on a frozen lake in Maine, surrounded by geometric patterns carved into ice that stretches to the horizon. They're looking at the camera like this is just another day at work, which for them, it was. They had no idea they were documenting the end of something. Within 30 years, every skill they possessed would be useless. Every technique they'd mastered, irrelevant. The lakes would still freeze. The ice would still form. But nobody would be cutting it anymore because nobody would need to. Sometimes entire industries don't decline. They just stop. And when they stop completely enough, fast enough, they fall out of memory altogether. We remember what left monuments behind. Ice left nothing but sawdust and empty warehouses. The vocabulary survived longer than the industry itself. We still say icebox, even though we mean refrigerator. We still call them ice trays. The language preserves what the infrastructure couldn't. 25 million tons a year, cut by hand and horse, shipped across oceans, stacked in wooden cathedrals insulated with sawdust. An empire built on frozen water. Then one day the machines arrived, and all of it became a footnote that nobody reads.